right, good afternoon. And welcome to the Pre-Plenary for EarnCon 2022. This year we're talking about the pursuit of racial and economic justice, the complex history of race and unions. I will get into a bit more about what we're going to be discussing in this plenary, but before we officially get things started, we did want to pause for a land acknowledgement, and so I want to invite Tarn Goelling to share that with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Frequently, when we talk about racial and economic justice, you hear the term BIPOC, which, if you're familiar with it, you know that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, which is an aggregate phrasing that makes referring to historically marginalized people a bit easier, a bit quicker, and a bit more convenient. It is an attempt to be inclusive. However, many times it's the first and last time that conversation arises about Indigenous peoples and the societies of various First Nations. It is my privilege and honor to recognize and acknowledge the space and place where we gather as guests on this land known today as Cleveland. There are no federally recognized tribes in the state of Ohio, but it is home to many Indigenous peoples. The land we all currently stand on was displaced from the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, who occupied spaces throughout the Great Lakes region. By the end of the 18th century, most tribal villages in Ohio were displaced by white settlements, ultimately ushering in the treaty era. The Treaty of Greenville is recognized as one of the seminal treaties in Ohio leading to the displacement of Indigenous peoples. Ultimately, Indigenous land holdings were reduced, and most Native people in Ohio were forcibly removed to pave the way for colonization of Ohio. Some of these removed tribes are actively working toward land reclamation in Ohio and retaining their culture despite many attempts to eradicate it, including outright genocide, to boarding schools, and to being forced onto reservations. Today, thousands of Indigenous peoples call Northeast Ohio home and thrive as integral parts of their respective communities. Let us recognize this land we are on in acknowledgement of the Indigenous people who first called present-day Ohio home. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for leading us in that. And it's very important to always acknowledge the full breadth of history and peoples in the United States, well, what we now call the United States. So again, I want to welcome you to this year's pre-plenary. As many of you know, this is the fourth year that PRE has been partnering and collaborating with the EARN team in putting on the EARN conference. And this is our second time in person. We first were able to participate in EarnCon when we met in Pittsburgh back in 2019. I just want to give you a quick commercial about PRE before we get into today's plenary. PRE was established in 2008. And the purpose and focus and sort of mission of PRE is summarized here on this slide. We explore and explain how race, ethnicity, and class intersect to affect economic outcomes in the United States. And I would add to that, another intersection that we focus on is gender. The little animation graphic that you see playing there on the screen as well was developed to promote our anti-racist economic research and policy resource guide that we published this summer. It is available on our website. The link is there for those who are interested in looking at that further. We'll also have a computer set up in the meet and greet with that available for folks to peruse and look through. It's a collection of essays on a number of topics related to economic research and policy, but we also included an interactive chart book that basically statistically summarizes race and ethnicity in this country across different areas, from the labor market, economic outcomes, wealth, health, the demographics of the country. So we think that's a very useful and meaningful resource that we wanted to make available to a wide audience of folks. Really building upon a speaker series that we did a couple years ago called Turning Good Intentions into Constructive Engagement on Race. So this was our way of sort of capturing that speaker series that was 7 sessions and putting it in a printed form, but within that handbook, as we call it, there are also links to the recordings of each of those workshops in that speaker series. So there's a lot of information there for you to take a look at. One other thing I want to say about PRE, before we officially get into our panel, I want to have an opportunity to introduce our staff. PRE is a growing department at EPI, and we're very excited about that. In addition to myself, I'm the director of PRE. We also have an economist on staff, Kyle Moore. I think there he is there. Many of you will get to hear from Kyle. After this session, he'll be leading a workshop on stratification economics and policy in post-COVID society. And then many of you also had an opportunity to hear from Adewale Maye this morning, who led the workshop on the history of the civil rights movement, or tracking the progress of the demands in the civil rights movement. He's our research and policy analyst. And then we have 2 postings currently on our website. We are hiring another economist/researcher that would be available not only to an economist, but other social scientists as well. And we also have a posting out now for a research assistant. So if anyone in the room, or if you know of anyone in the room who may be interested in those positions, please send them our way. All right, all that aside, we can get on with the business of this plenary. Here we go. So we are joined today by 3 fantastic panelists. You're in for a treat. When we had our sort of pre-prep planning call, I mean, I was so excited about, just sort of where that conversation was going then, that I really couldn't wait until we got to today. So I'm excited that we're finally here today, and I'm going to briefly introduce them, give you their names and their titles. There's more information about them in the bio, but I have no doubt that over the course of this conversation, that you will get to know much more about them from just hearing them speak than I could ever read to you from a bio anyway. So we are joined by Tarn Goelling, who is IBEW Director of Civic and Community Engagement. She's also on the National Executive Board of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, also known as APALA. Next to Tarn is Dr. William P. Jones, who is a history professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And on the end of our panel, we have Tanya Wallace-Gobern, who's Executive Director of the National Black Worker Center. So I've already mentioned, we're talking, oh, yes, please. So I've already mentioned that our setup today is to talk about the complex history of race and unions, and we are starting out acknowledging that it is a complex history, if for no other reason than people are a part of unions, and as people in this country, we've all been exposed to programming and narratives and experiences that have been shaped by racism, sexism, homophobia, all of the other things that are present in this society. So any institution that we're going to be trying to understand or work within is going to be influenced by all of these things, and it's important to have an accurate understanding and reflection of the history that contributes to how these things function, as well as thinking about ways that we can make positive changes moving forward. I don't have to tell any of you about the value and importance of unions in building power by giving workers a collective voice. That function is particularly important for Black, Latino, AAPI, Native American, other workers of color because labor contracts provide a level of transparency and consistency of policies and pay structures that, by their very nature, prevent a lot of discretion in deciding how people are going to be paid or how people are going to be treated. It really codifies it and puts it plain and in writing that these are the rules that we're going to follow for anybody who fills a certain position in a given organization. I think also we heard earlier this morning about how valuable unions can be in terms of the solidarity among workers and workers really standing up and standing in for one another and helping to protect one another on the job. And I often say, I think that unions are a very important proactive measure in terms of anti-discrimination enforcement in this country. The way that the legal structure is set up is that all of the action happens after the fact. So you have to be discriminated against, you have to recognize that it's happened, you have to prove that it's happened, and then there may be some compensation or something, but that's going to take a long time. The odds are going to be stacked against you just because of the information that you may or may not have access to, as well as the cost associated with a legal case. And so unions provide a very important function in terms of proactively enforcing anti-discrimination in the workforce. Given that importance and that role, maybe it's not a surprise that we see a graph like the one on your screen. We can see that starting in the early to mid 70s, the highest rates of union membership were among Black and Latino workers. There was a recognition of the value and importance of that collective action in helping workers to have a voice and to be able to enforce their rights. Throughout the 70s, there's been a sharp decline that's been across all groups of workers, down to the point where we see now where there really is very little difference across all groups of workers in terms of rates of union membership. The other side just gives you a few of the statistics about the magnitude of those declines over time. And I will make note that our series for AAPI workers starts in 1989 as opposed to 1973 like the others. But even with that, you see that there's still, union membership has been cut by nearly half in those years. The next thing I want to sort of put on the table are just some of the current statistics about where things stand now. Now, a lot of this information, the previous graph was looking at membership, people who are union members. These statistics have more to do with the union coverage rates. Are you in a job that is covered by a union contract, whether you're a member or not? More than a third of workers covered by a union contract are workers of color. Black workers continue to have the highest rates of union coverage. This is saying about 13.5%, compared with about 12% of white workers, about 10.5% of AAPI workers, and 10.2% of Hispanic workers. And again, the value of that we can measure when we look at the wage premium. What is the additional benefit to a worker covered by a union contract compared to a worker with similar skills, maybe in a similar occupation who's not covered by such a contract? And you see that the advantage, the union advantage, the union premium is much greater for Hispanic and Black workers than for white workers because of the level of discrimination that those workers face in the workforce, broadly speaking. So this is sort of the foundation that we want to build upon for our conversation this afternoon. We're going to get into the history of Black, Latino, and AAPI workers and the labor movement. We're going to talk some about current issues and campaigns at the intersection of race, gender, and economic justice. And then we want to really open this conversation to you, to talk about some of the things that are happening in your states and opportunities for advancing an inclusive agenda that incorporates workers' rights with racial justice, gender justice, and all of the other issues of justice that are important to workers and their families. So with that, I'm going to stop talking so much and give you a chance to hear from our outstanding panelists. And as I mentioned, we wanted to set it up first to sort of get into some of the history behind race and the labor movement. And what better way to do that than to have a history professor on the panel to talk about those things? And so, Dr. Jones, your work focuses on the relationship between race and class and the connection to labor history. Again, by way of sort of giving you a chance to kind of share your bio with us in the process of sharing your expertise, I want to ask you first, what influenced you to pursue that line of study? And then I'd like for you to get into a bit of a history lesson for us and talk about some of the significant events, policies, or transitions over time that brought significant numbers of Black, Latino, and AAPI workers into the labor movement.
Okay, thank you. Is it working? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Valerie. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's really been a fascinating couple days. So my interest in studying race and labor actually, I think, comes pretty directly from my experience as a middle school teacher in New Orleans before Katrina, which meant that I was a member of the United Teachers of New Orleans, the AFT, before the school district was privatized. Katrina was used as an excuse to privatize the school district, which temporarily destroyed the union. They've come back since then. But I think seeing working in almost entirely African-American school district, the students are over 95% Black. The teachers are largely Black. It struck me that it became very apparent to me the way in which the union served as a vehicle, in part for protecting teachers from the effects of a very severe austerity. So in terms of our wages and our working conditions, things like class size and those conditions, but also pushing back against the austerity. And it was really one of the only powerful forces in the city, really representing the interests of our mostly working class African American students. And that really had a powerful effect on me in the years before I decided to become a historian, and I went to graduate school, and that was what I wanted to study, these intersections between race and class. In terms of the understanding the history, I really take my cue from W.E.B. Du Bois, who made the point that the history of labor in the United States has always had workers of color at the center of it, right? So when we think about what is the labor movement, we need to think beyond the union movement. Du Bois pointed out that one of the most important events in US labor history was what he called a general strike of enslaved workers during the Civil War. And that the history of labor in the United States has always been about the history of enslavement and forced labor, about imperialism, and about, I would add, about the history of paid work, of care work, both paid and unpaid, in workers' own households and in employed work outside of workers' households. So I think we need to think about, when we think about the history of labor, in those expansive terms. So I think in terms of the policies that we think about shaping labor history, we need to, I think in some respects, begin with the struggles over enslavement and abolition, policies related to imperialism, about the dispossession of land, that these are all parts of our labor history. Immigration restriction, which has always been, from the very beginning, policies about the control of labor, but also policies about creating racial inequality. I would point to I think we're all familiar with the labor laws of the 1930s, perhaps most importantly, the National Labor Relations Act. Again, I think it's important to think of both the effects that those laws had on workers of color. So those laws gave new rights to Black and Latino and Asian American workers who had not had them. I've written about Black workers who gained the right to vote in NLRB elections before they had the right to vote for mayors and for the president. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that those laws had huge exclusions that primarily targeted workers of color, so domestic workers, agricultural workers. A group that's often forgotten is public employees were also excluded from the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the minimum wage laws. So I guess I would point to the third sort of period that I would point to is the changes in the 1960s and 1970s, in which movements like the farm workers movement, the civil rights movement, movements of domestic workers, both challenged those exclusions and brought new workers into the more formal labor movement. That's the moment at which we see some of the trends that Valerie pointed to in the graphs, in which workers of color become much more likely to be involved in what we might think of as sort of the formal labor movement, the official labor movement. Again, keeping in mind that they have always been central to what I think we should think of as the labor movement in the United States.
Thank you. That's a great way of tying all that together. I want to turn now to Tarn and Tanya and ask you both the same question. You're both contemporary history makers. As women of color in leadership within labor and within the labor movement, can you tell us about the path that brought you to where you are? And are there any specific people or events that inspired you or have influenced the way that you approach your work in empowering the people and communities that you represent?
Sure, I'll go first. I really love this question because at the National Black Worker Center, when we first are working with new workers, we ask them to tell us their working while Black story. And it's a way for us to build solidarity, to make sure that people are seen, and to recognize that what you may see as something that's just happening to you is not just happening to you. And so I want to start by just sharing my working while Black story. So I'm originally from Chicago, and my earliest experiences of racism in terms of not knowing how to address it really have shaped who I am today. And so when I went to college, I went to a predominantly white institution, university, and I would tell my friends that went to HBCUs, historical Black colleges and universities, that I went to war. You all went to school. College was the first place that I ever saw nigger written. And when I saw it, I read Niger, and it just caught my attention. I couldn't even pronounce it because I had never seen it written before. And when I went to my dean to report it, he told me I was mistaken, that would never be in Loyola University of Chicago. I asked him to come with me. I'll point it out. He wouldn't come with me. And so this was back in the 80s, so I had to get on the bus, go to Walgreens, get a disposable camera, come back, take a picture, go back on the bus, take it back to Walgreens to get the film developed. The next day, my dean came to my political science class and asked me to show him where it was written. I'm 18, I'm excited. I think that I'm being heard, seen, recognized. And I go back to the stairwell and it's been painted over. But I had the picture. So I got my film developed and I came back and I was able to show him that it was true. But that wasn't my first experience. The next experience, or another experience, was having students tell me that my presence at my school was preventing other white kids from being there. And they didn't get the scholarship money that they should have because all the Black kids were getting the scholarships. And I didn't get a scholarship. Again, I'm 19, so I go to financial aid to let them know I didn't get my Black scholarship. The woman behind the counter was Black and told me to sit my behind down and waited until everyone left to let me know that there was no such thing as a Black scholarship. Those experiences helped me to make a decision. And the decision was I would either shrink back or step up. And I decided to step up and to make sure that I was seen, and that led me to working in organized labor and working with the union. And in my first year working with the union, I was asked to write a report. And I submitted the report to my supervisor. And my supervisor calls me into a meeting in his office, and he closed the door behind him and demanded to know who wrote the report for me. And we go back and forth. I'm talking about how I wrote it, what research I did, how I contributed to it, that I wrote it myself. And then after a while, he goes, okay, well, it's because you didn't go to an HBCU. And I didn't know what to say. I was stunned. I was humiliated. I was embarrassed because I felt like I didn't represent my community. And so it's been those experiences that have led me to the work that I'm doing now. And the last experience that I'll share is my first organizing drive in Hazlehurst, Mississippi. We won this campaign. It was sweatshop workers who made uniforms for Catholic schools and the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and the like, and we won the campaign. And that meant that we were going to have the union, the workers were going to have the union, we were having a big celebratory party, and one of the lead activists wasn't there. And we were all looking for Clara. We didn't see Clara. She was the first one to pass out leaflets. She was the first one who stood up to the boss. She was the first one to wear a t-shirt, but she wasn't there. And then as the night went on, Clara drove up with her car packed. Furniture on top of it, you couldn't see through the windows, her kids are in tow, and we asked her what in the world was going on. Clara shared with us that she had been in an abusive relationship and decided once we won our union, I will never forget this, her words were, if I can stand up in my job, I can stand up anywhere. That has shaped my understanding of power. Power isn't something that's connected to a contract or a particular job. It is the development that comes from within. And my motto has been that in this worker movement, it's not so much that we are organizing people to get better benefits and get higher pay, and that is something that we want, obviously, but we're organizing people because we recognize that workers are not a monolith. They're mothers, they're fathers, they're sisters, they're brothers. And I carry the spirit of Clara with me because I know that if we can stand up on our job, we can stand up in our homes, we can stand up in our neighborhoods, we can stand up in this country, we can build real, true power and build a country that we're all proud of.
I love my sister. That's the bottom line of what I bring to my work is how many sisters and brothers and siblings I've adopted just by being within a union. For me, I entered the building trades. The IBW is International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and I am actually an electrical worker. I came through an apprenticeship program, a 5-year apprenticeship program, and I worked out in the field as a journey level electrician. When I entered the building trades, I was at the advanced age of 26, which is older for a lot of new apprentices coming in. My parents were pretty surprised because I had gone to college. I had a bachelor's degree in philosophy, the very most practical of bachelor's degrees. But they were surprised that I took on such a labor-intensive career. And being immigrants, that also informed a lot of what I experienced growing up. My father, who back in Thailand was a teacher, a highly revered intellectual position, he came here and because of his language difficulties, took on blue-collar work. And he did a lot of handiwork, And so I was very familiar with a lot of tools, power tools. I used to get in his way and want to play with everything. But because I was his daughter, because I was a girl, he always shooed me away. You know, this is dirty. You're going to get sawdust in your hair, you know. And so it was a reality that I had, but it always kind of confused me a little bit. Like, why can't I get my hair dirty? I don't understand. My mom was also in the Army when she came here. After she came here. She enrolled in the U.S. Army, and I knew her always as a sergeant in the Army. When she passed away, she was a master sergeant. And the things that I saw my mother do from a physical perspective always left me with the confidence that there is no barrier between the genders in doing what we can do. It is just a matter of what you practice and a matter of what you push yourself to do. And so between both of my mom and my dad, I was very influenced in the way where equity was not a question. It was just something you fought for constantly. I also joined, when I joined the union, I also joined the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, which Valerie mentioned earlier. We call it APALA for short. And I started with that as a member when I was a second-year apprentice at my apprenticeship. And what I learned from APALA was a worldview that allows us to come together collectively as a community and fight for what matters. That's something that you think that unions are for, right? Is that collective voice and the collective power for collective bargaining. But in the building trades, it's not as direct of a relationship to the membership, because a lot of times it has become transactional instead of transformational because of the established nature of the building trades. But I was able to experience that level of community and belonging within APALA, one of these constituency groups of the AFL-CIO. And also within the apprenticeship model itself provided this spirit of guidance and mentorship and a lifelong connection with people who have guided you along the path. And that is something that I really cherish, because to me, the people I've worked with aren't just coworkers and they're not just colleagues. They really are my union family, and that means something for an immigrant who only has like 6 family members in this country. Excuse me. So I bring that to the work that I do and fight for our members who need these resources, who don't have the ability to have an uncle, a brother, or a cousin who is in the trades, right? Who were just brought in just because they talk about this stuff at the dinner table all the time. I come with this experience of being a first-generation union member. And I bring that to all of our members who I represent, and hope to be able to craft that level of engagement with that level of appreciation as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all for sharing your personal stories and personal experiences. I think that is so important in understanding the work that we do, and because, like I said before, we're all people. We bring ourselves and our human experiences to everything that we do. So I appreciate you all sharing that and helping to really ground this conversation a bit more. I want to get now into maybe something that'll feel a little more uncomfortable, more thorny part of this conversation as we really zero in more on this issue of race. And the primary interest of the labor movement is workers' rights. It has, at times, often intersected with broader movements for social justice and economic justice, and probably one of the most referenced is the Civil Rights Movement and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. There was a workshop talking about this very thing this morning. And I think that's often lifted up as a shining example of the power of racial solidarity and alignment of mutual interests. And so I want to start this question with you, Will, and ask you, as a history professor, what is your assessment of the March on the Washington and that moment in history? Feel free to bring in any thoughts you may have about the earlier workshop, because I know that you were present there as well. And then what lessons can our 21st century minds really learn from that, both in terms of positives, things that were done well that we should make sure we replicate, and maybe missed opportunities or things that weren't handled so well?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I do think that I think it deserves the reputation as a shining example. I think it was and I think we often forget what it was that made it so powerful. Historian Philip Foner pointed out that it was probably the largest march of union members in American history. And it was actually not endorsed by the AFL-CIO, but in spite of that, it was largely built by working people through their unions. And it was one that really I think very successfully put the interests of working class Black people and other people of color at the center of a national conversation about policy. And I think that very rarely, there may be no other point in American history where that has been the case so successfully. So I can talk about a lot of limitations to what it accomplished, but I think that we should, I'd like to focus on what it really did in a unique way. I take three really, I think, sort of key lessons from the march and the mobilization. And a lot of this actually came up in that great panel this morning, and there was a really great discussion about the importance of understanding that it was not just the march, but that it was organized and the process of organizing it. And one of the things that I think is often forgotten was that it was actually a march that was carried out in 1963 that was initially planned in 1941. And the same people organized both of those marches, and in many respects spent the 20 years between them planning the 1963 march. So it wasn't just, let's meet at the Lincoln Memorial. It was a 20-year process of organizing. So I think the three things that I sort of take away, the lessons I would take away for today, is the importance of leadership from people of color in building that march, both inside and outside of the union movement. So people like A. Philip Randolph, Cleveland Robinson, Addie Wyatt, Maida Springer. These were trade unionists who had deep connections to both the labor movement and outside of the labor movement, to community organizations, the NAACP. One thing that's almost always forgotten is the central role that Black women's organizations played in building the march, both the one in 1941 and in 1963, churches, and an organization that's almost completely forgotten, the Negro American Labor Council, which was an organization of several thousand Black trade unionists. What was key about the Negro American Labor Council is that the leadership of this organization were also leaders of NAACP branches. They were deacons in their churches. They were leaders of Black women's clubs in their organizations. So they could mobilize people, again, within the labor movement, but also outside of the labor movement. And that was really the source of what I think is the second really important lesson, which is the explicit link that the march made between racial justice and economic justice. And the point that was reiterated over and over and over at the march and in the organization of the march, that you couldn't have one without the other, that the two were sort of mutually constituted. Initially, actually, the march was proposed as a march for jobs. It was actually initially proposed as a march against the national headquarters of the AFL-CIO, which was not supporting a call for expelling segregationist and discriminatory unions from its organization. And it was actually Anna Arnold Hedgeman. Raise your hand if you've heard that name. Okay, I do this whenever I ask this question, she's actually perhaps the most important person involved in the march in organizing the March on Washington. So if you don't know, there's a great biography about her, go look it up. Look up who she was. It was actually, she pointed out that that the mostly male trade unionists who wanted to march for jobs were ignoring the fact that there was also a vibrant movement going on, largely in the South, for voting rights, for access to education and public services, and that the march couldn't actually succeed without forming an alliance with that movement. So she coined the phrase for jobs and freedom as a way of connecting what was in some ways a sort of northern black trade union movement and a southern civil rights movement, but one that connected the demands for racial equality and economic justice. And you can see that connection very powerfully if you look at the official demands of the march. The last thing I'll say is just, I think there's a myth that's a very powerful myth out there that the March on Washington was successful because it had very narrow, sort of realistic goals. And that is exactly the opposite of the truth. It was successful because it was expansive and bold and extremely radical. They called for a federal jobs creation program to create dignified and meaningful jobs at a living wage for all workers. They called for raising the minimum wage to $2 an hour, which in today's term is about $19 an hour. And they called for extending the Fair Labor Standards Act to all workers, including domestic workers, farm workers, public employees, all of the workers who were excluded from these laws. So that was on top of demanding extremely powerful enforcement of voting rights, of desegregation. They called for the immediate desegregation of all schools in that year. They called for the removal of federal funds from any local agency that discriminated or violated people's rights. They called for the federal enforcement of the 14th Amendment, which you may not have to, you shouldn't have to call for, but they did, and is still not true. They called for part of the enforcement of the 14th Amendment would be the denial of congressional representation to any state in which people were denied the right to vote. So we have this sense that it was this sort of moderate, sort of open-ended set of demands, but if you read the demands, it was actually a very radical march, and that's actually what I think made it successful.
Thank you.
Valerie, if I can, I just want to add another lesson from the civil rights movement, from my perspective, is that we should never forget the role that violence and aggression played in this movement. And so when we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about the fact that the movement was nonviolent, but the response to it was met with violence and met with aggression. And I think that we see the same thing happening today. The other thing that was happening before I move on is the ways that laws were used to try to prevent people from standing up for themselves and for their rights. And we see the same thing happening today with the movement for Black Lives, right? And the violent response to that. And the ways that we see laws being twisted with within the civil rights movement. If you think about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, laws were changed to say that cab drivers would not be able to lower their fares to make it more, affordable for people to get back and forth from work. Insurance companies were pressured to not give insurance to Black cab drivers so they wouldn't be able to drive and use their personal vehicles to getting people to work. And what we see happening in our country now is that 8 states have passed laws against so-called rioting and protesting. And the way that they're defining rioting is if 3 or more people gather in a demonstration, that's considered protesting. And that's in direct response to people during this dual pandemic of COVID and fights for racial justice, protesting, going out in the streets, demonstrating. It's a direct response to try to squash that. And so as we talk about the civil rights movements, we also have to be mindful of the ways that this country, our government, will try to squash any protest, any standing up for dignity and respect.
I thank you for bringing that up, and that really is a good transition to the next question I wanted to pose for you. So we talk about the civil rights movement as a good example of things that can happen when people come together and organize. And an alignment of workers' issues, economic justice, civil rights, all of those things. But we also have some recent examples where the objectives of racial justice movements have been in direct conflict with workers' rights, or at least some workers' rights. And I'm speaking specifically about the movement for Black Lives and all of the activism around police brutality against Black people, and the need to change the policies that enable that, in contrast to what many people see as police unions basically shielding guilty officers from accountability. So the question I want to pose to you, and I think this is maybe it's unique, maybe it's not. That's the question I will ask you. Is this really a unique misalignment or sort of conflict between workers' rights and civil and human rights? And what do you see as the way forward to reconcile that particular conflict?
So I would start by saying that it is the nature of power to keep us disorganized and confused so that we are not in alignment with one another, right? So that we're not focused on building power. And so that is intentional. And it's also, with the question that you asked specifically, it's a misalignment of interest, right? So the promise of organized labor and unions is dignity and respect for all workers. The stereotypes, right, up against unions is that these union thugs protect lazy, bad, overpaid workers. And so when these bad actors are protected and shielded from accountability, the message shifts from human and civil rights to a message of privilege and systemic racism that marginalizes people of color. Civil rights and worker rights are human rights, period. There is no conflict. There should be no conflict. And what we see is that the public has made the connection of police violence plus police unions equal no justice, which is ironic when you think about the slogan that we hear from a lot of unions, right? No justice, no peace, right? And so what labor has to do, I think, is to focus on what a true value proposition should be for unions and for union members. And that is that the value proposition is that union workers are the best trained, the most valuable, they're highly skilled professionals. And the House of Labor must make good on its rhetoric that says that assault to one is an assault to all. Unions need to acknowledge and tackle their racism issues and history of racism within their organizations. It won't be pretty, it won't be short, but I believe that at the end of it, we'll have a stronger labor movement.
Thank you. And Tarn, I want to pose a related question to you. Another aspect of this complex history of race and unions has involved the scapegoating of workers of color and immigrants, in particular when it comes to stoking racist and xenophobic ideas in response to fears of an economic threat or economic vulnerability among white workers in particular. How have we seen examples of that in the experiences of workers of color and perhaps in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities specifically?
Yeah, thank you. You know, the AAPI struggle is twofold, in that on the one hand, there is a struggle of invisibility. Our histories are erased. Even color is ignored, often perceived, a lot of AAPIs are perceived as by others as white, depending on the depth of our skin tone. But it's often because Asian Americans are set on a pedestal under the mythology of the model minority, right? They did it the right way, and they're following the rules, they're legal, and you know, all of that. The flip side of the being invisible is that of exotification and being objectified. And that's seen where, you know, the history of Orientalism is heightened at the intersection of ethnic and gender identity. And we saw that most recently last year with the massacres at massage parlors in Georgia, where the workers were predominantly AAPI workers, and they were women, and they were seen through that hypersexual lens, and ultimately they paid the price with their lives because of the twisted perception of a white man. And that's just recent, right? If you go back a couple decades, within unions, we've seen how racism targeted AAPIs within the UAW. Vincent Chin was 27 years old and was about to be married when he was murdered during a time of heightened anti-Japanese sentiment. Never mind that Vincent Chin was Chinese American. So this was in 1982. Vincent Chin was murdered by two men who worked in the auto industry because they thought he was Japanese, and therefore the cause of their economic insecurity, just as Valerie mentioned. Now, we understand today, when we're looking and talking about economic justice with racial justice as centered in this concept, that labor unions cannot forget to actually speak up to the histories of our own past and talk clearly and definitely about how we have caused harm onto our own people. So labor unions cannot be immune from the internal examination of our own pasts, and that other institutions and government agencies are experiencing as well. But doing so actually will provide that sense of solidarity across the entire labor movement. Now, the words that I just spoke were drawn specifically from an article written on the UAW website. And the UAW has taken these steps to ameliorate a bit of their past by publicizing these events, by taking ownership and onus of the responsibility of what a parent organization has. And the author of this article, Sandra Engel, is actually a fellow board member of mine on APALA. And that's what we see when we have representation at the highest levels of our unions. We see these very difficult conversations being able to be had with leadership in a way that if Sandra was not in the director role that she's in, she would not have had access to her peers and her supervisors. So it's really important that why representation matters, not just to put on a glossy magazine, but these are the actual movers and change makers that are in our unions today. But this was in the 80s, and we have seen this anti-Asian sentiment going all the way back through US history. This has been evidenced and is frequently forgotten or purposefully omitted from discourse, but it goes all the way back to the 1800s when Chinese migrants settled into this country and helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Chinese workers were treated less than white workers. They were provided with lower wages and given inhumane living conditions. The multi-tiered workforce, that's what happens when you pay a certain subset of people less than others. This multi-tiered workforce actually divided the entire workforce by racial lines and created a hotbed of xenophobia, which resulted in the only law in American history that outright bans immigrants from a specific country of origin, and that was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So you can see how cultural xenophobia sentiment can directly translate into policy that is entirely detrimental to a subset of our population when that's what we have to fight against in building solidarity, and how do we dismantle these existing structures as well as change culture in order to be able to move forward.
I want to follow up on that point and open this. Will, you may want to weigh in on this as well. And think about how immigration is an issue that has not gone away and won't ever go away in the history of this country. And the way that we have addressed that over the years has varied. It's varied across countries. How do you see this issue of immigration and othering and the concept of economic threat being reflected in some of the differing views on immigration even within the organized labor movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess I would sort of, to go back to the broader question of, I think the issue of police unions and of immigration, I mean, for one, both of these debates remind me very powerfully of the issues around exclusion and segregation within the union movement that really was at the root of the March on Washington in 1963. I mean, the problem was that the top leadership of the AFL-CIO refused to confront the racism within the union movement. And I think there were two causes of that. One was was racism within the union movement. The other was that people who were more liberal, white leadership of the union movement, who feared that sort of criticizing the union movement was going to weaken it. And as a result, they were very resistant to taking what were pretty moderate measures to do this. And I think you see this within the resistance to criticizing police unions from within the labor movement, and this ongoing debate over how to deal with immigration and immigration restriction. I think a few things that I would point to that I think are important for all of us to be aware of is that immigration restriction, as Tarn pointed out, has always been racist from its very beginning. So there's not a sense that we can sort of say, well, this is sort of economic protection, it's protecting domestic workers. It was Chinese workers. Almost all of the workers who were involved in the rail industry in the 1880s were immigrants. But it was just the Chinese ones who were singled out as sort of the economic threat. So the racism has been there from the beginning, and unions need to acknowledge that and start from that position. I think in many respects in the past couple decades, we've seen a dramatic shift in the AFL-CIO and in a number of unions toward actually recognizing the degree to which I think a position that has come from immigrant workers, which is that immigrant rights are worker rights, and that the two things go hand in hand. But that has not always been, and rarely has actually too often not been the case within the labor movement. So I think actually that's something that we've seen more recently. I remain frustrated over the labor movement's response to police unions, because I think it's clearly an example of people abusing collective bargaining rights, discrediting the whole process of collective bargaining, and really, providing an example for anybody who wants to use it of unions using the collective bargaining process to defend people who are breaking the law and violating people's civil rights. And I think as long as the union movement allows those types of examples to stand, that's going to be a liability for the union movement, whether it's in terms of police brutality or the rights of immigrants. And I think they're very similar, actually.
Tanya, we had an opportunity to chat a bit before we came up on the stage, and you shared that the National Black Worker Center is growing. So at this point in our conversation, I want to pivot a bit and give you a chance, and Tarn, you as well, to talk about some of the specific problems your organizations are trying to address as it relates to racial, gender, and economic justice. I wonder if you would share some of the current campaigns or programs or efforts you've been engaged in to accomplish those goals.
Sure. So the National Black Worker Center is a network of 12 Black worker centers across the country, and we exist to end racism and discrimination in the workplace. From our perspective, Black workers are the equivalent of the canary in the economic coal mines of this country. And so if you think about the canary and the coal mine analogy, the canary was sent into the coal mines, and when the canary died, that signaled to the coal miners, right, that the levels had gotten so toxic that they need to get out. And that's what happens within the Black community. When you think about any of the isms, racism, discrimination, all of the like, right, it comes to our community first. We're hit first, we're hit hardest. I was reading a couple of weeks ago about how the numbers, the unemployment numbers are, increasing for everyone in this country except for Black workers. For Black workers, they're even lower than they used to be. They're so low that they are the equivalent to, for women, Black women, to the rates of 1967. And so we know that racism doesn't, or activism doesn't trickle down to impact racism. We know how difficult those conversations have been historically in this country to address. And so our center, our worker centers are the only centers, worker centers, that are solely and specifically created to have those discussions, to train people on how to deal with the racism and discrimination that they experience in the workplace, so that Black workers are not confused, they're not ashamed, they're not hidden, and their issues are addressed. So the types of work that we do is different from other worker centers. So we don't do individual servicing, for example. We launch large-scale campaigns to lift up as many Black workers as we can. An initiative that we launched this year is centered around the meatpacking industry. And I'm not sure if people are aware, but during the height of COVID, when we were all applauding essential workers and thanking them for their service and their time, meatpacking workers were deemed as essential. So essential that they couldn't stop working. So essential that managers took bets on how many of them would die in the workplace or how many of them would test positive. The meatpacking industry is predominantly an industry of Black and brown workers, the lowest paid workers. They also, what we're seeing is that this industry, to make the situation even worse, is now becoming more predominantly filled with temporary workers. Temporary workers who saw the temp industry or the temp facility as a way to get their foot in the door, but end up working for 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, still in that temporary status. The other thing that we see in the meat processing industry is that 30% of that industry is populated by the formerly incarcerated. Workers who, if they complain about working conditions, are threatened that they'll, be reported to their probation officer and be sent back to prison. And so what we've decided to do at the National Black Worker Center is really look at this collision, if you will, of travesty within this industry and support these workers to help them to stand up in their workplaces. We've created an initiative that's called Black that partners these employees with social justice attorneys that they don't have to pay for so they can file litigation against their employers. One of the things that we found is that, one, we all know this, the EOC process takes forever, and so people get frustrated and they quit and they leave their job before there's any type of restitution, if any, because EOC is tremendously underfunded, or workers will attempt to get their own attorney. The attorney won't want to take on the boss oftentimes, or the attorney takes their money and they never hear from them again. And so when we think about building power, one of the things that we want to do and are working to do is bring immediate relief to this segregation of workers.
Tarn, you want to share some of the things that IBEW is working on?
Yes, thank you. IBEW has launched our internal campaign called IBEW Strong, and that is the reevaluation of the internal structure to make sure that everything, all of the work that we do at the international office is done with a diversity, equity, inclusion lens. Making sure that there is the right representation at every single level of what we're doing. So that effort has been an ongoing process for the last 3-4 years, and we are seeing results from it within our union. We have international affinity committees that are representative of our membership for women, for young workers, and for veterans. And this is a way that we are helping for the IBW Strong program to really reach out to our local unions as well. Part of IBW Strong is also making sure that we are facilitating labor management relationships outside of the bargaining table. And the way we're doing that is on our construction side, we're working with our National Electrical Contractors Association. And again, that is a task force, it's a joint task force specifically on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. On our energy side, we also represent utility workers. We have had a number of national utilities who have come to us to ask how they can partnership with us. And we've actually seen some interesting crossover where on our construction branches, the workers, the labor union side actually has a say on who comes into the apprenticeship programs because it is a joint sponsored entity. We don't have that on our professional and industrial side. However, with working with Berkshire Hathaway, we have an avenue now where our local union is actually partnering hand in hand with the HR teams to sit on these interviews of people coming in to the skilled side and even the office side of these utilities, and the workers have a say, have the ability to say, you know, this is the type of skill set that someone who is here at the table with us has, but their papers don't necessarily say it, but we can see that they have it, right? So having workers at that decision-making level is imperative. So we've been seeing some really good results from those labor management efforts. Also part of IBW Strong is making sure that all of our staff are fully trained on the topics that are of importance within this field of DEIB. And what part of that is making sure that every single staff member has gone through an internal implicit bias training. And that has brought on a lot of discussions within the staff itself because it's our international staff that go out and help local unions. And if problems are happening at the locals and our staff aren't properly trained for it, then a lot of times the problems just disappear. Right? They don't disappear, but they just disappear. And so making sure that all levels of our union are properly trained is also part of the mission of IBW Strong. And most recently, at our international convention, the IBW has a convention every 5 years. We're reminded that this is a governing body, and it is the highest level of our democracy within the union. And at our most recent one, a number of resolutions and amendments were passed revolving around IBW Strong and all of the work that we're doing. But two that stand out to me are, one, we added words to our declaration. Part of our declaration has a statement about what it is that IBW opposes and what we stand against and will fight in order to uphold our own values. And we added the actual words racism and sexism to what the IBW opposes and will stand against. And the second is that we are going to be editing our legal documents to be gender neutral as opposed to gender inclusive. And so part of this whole process of drafting up gender neutral language for amending the Constitution was actually an education process of why it's even necessary. It has become part of, again, our culture of just, oh, you know, his, him, and her, and all of that. It means everybody, right? Like when you're just referring to the male counterpart of a title, a job description, or whatever, it's inclusive of everyone. And so having those education conversations with leadership is what led to the result of this. Because when your top officers, the top people who are going to fight for it are in agreement and can also feel comfortable with having that conversation with anybody who is questioning it, it puts you in a better place to be able to make those lasting changes. So those are some highlights of what IBW has been working on these last few years.
Those are all important steps that your organizations are taking, and really makes the point that I make all the time, in that resolving racial inequality is never something that just organically happens. It has to be intentional. You have to say, we're going to address this, and then get busy with the work and actually doing that. At this point in our program, we want to have an opportunity to hear more from you all. I'm going to pose these questions for our panelists to weigh in on, but I also invite you to weigh in on each of these questions, or if you have another question that you'd like to pose to one of our panelists, we welcome that as well. But this is the EARN conference. These are state-based policy, research, grassroots organizations. So I'd like to shift the conversation a bit to talk more about what role state policy has played in the trend that we started with. Are there particular states or industries that play a key role in shaping the national trends among different demographic groups? And then where are there opportunities to strengthen and build support for organizing efforts? So I'll pose that to any of the panelists to weigh in on, and also invite you all to join in on that conversation as well.
I'll jump in on specifically state level. What we see in construction is the importance of the state level governance to make sure that Davis-Bacon is supported within the state. And that's, of course, very state specific. PLAs and community benefit agreements happen also at that local level, and that is really how we can get more people of color into the building trades, specifically with the community benefit agreements. Some owners who are contracting our workers are actually mandating that there be diversity goals within the workforce, but that's actually kind of few and far between, and it can't just be relying on the owners to make that as a demand. It really needs to be the entire community stepping forward and saying that this is what we need to see. And where we've seen changes in the body of our membership is where there have been efforts like that locally, like in Boston, where the diversity goals were actually enforced by our membership, by our local up there, as well as government entities. And so whatever we can do to support that type of relationship at the state level is absolutely great. And the other thing I'm gonna say is pre-apprenticeship programs are very successful in getting people of color and women into traditionally white male apprenticeship programs. That is where funds that come from grants, you know, it could be federal grants that trickle to the states, but that is where those monies most directly impact the people who need it. People like single mothers who need childcare in order to go to work on a construction site. People who need transportation vouchers to get them to the apprenticeship program. So any help that can be made at that level is absolutely beneficial. And if your EARN, I don't know what your entity is called, but if your EARN entity is in a space where there are pre-apprenticeship programs, I highly encourage you and beg you to make that connection and be that bridge, because we need support from researchers to write those grants and to give background on making that argument, because we're just construction workers. We don't know how to do that kind of thing. We want to bring more people in, but we need that academic support as well.
So I would just share that it is not a coincidence that the states that first banned abortion are also largely the states with the lowest minimum wages, the states that are least likely to have expanded Medicaid. They are the states that are mostly anti-union, right-to-work states, and they are the states with higher than average incarceration rates. So for example, among the states that banned it, abortion, the average minimum wage is $8.39 compared to the minimum wage of $11.48 in the states that have access to abortion. The other issue that I would lift up is preemption. and blocking progressive cities such as North Carolina and other cities across the country, blocking having the General Assembly pass these laws that forbids municipalities from raising their minimum wage. The exemption laws are part of a growing trend that we see by anti-union forces to stop the Fight for 15 movement, especially in cities where Democratic voters control the government. Right now, 23 states have preemptive laws banning cities from passing laws increasing the minimum wage. Every state in the South, except for 2, West Virginia and Arkansas, have these efforts, and those 2 states have efforts, right, to start preemptive laws. And so it's one of those things that we have to pay attention to. In our organization, when we first started our work, we didn't get involved in politics, right? We talked about just building power at the grassroots level. We understand that these go hand in hand, and the activities that we do, the wins that we make at the city level can quickly be lost if we don't get involved into in legislation.
I just want to add that I think the ongoing struggles around who's included in labor laws is really critical. And so you see these, really important fights at the state level around covering, like California just passed this fast food worker sectoral bargaining law. The struggles in Virginia and Colorado, other states around public sector collective bargaining laws, these disproportionately affect workers of color and are really important for these long-standing inequalities. One, I think, example in Colorado just passed a collective bargaining law for county employees that restricted police unions' ability to use collective bargaining to insulate police from use of force violations. This is the kind of thing that I've been looking for these examples, and this is one of the few cases where that's been been done successfully. It was done, my understanding, is through cooperation between the Black Caucus in the state legislature and public sector unions that saw this as a way of trying, an important thing, but the Black Caucus wasn't going to allow this law to strengthen collective bargaining rights for public employees if it was going to increase the ability of police to insulate themselves. So I think that's a really important thing to look at.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Norma, and I'm with Recovery for All in Connecticut. In Connecticut, we are trying to link, trying to connect or just be out front and vocal about the link between austerity and then the cuts in staffing at the state level. We have over 1,000 state vacancies in the public sector, and we know, and CT Voices has done a really great research around public sector jobs and the movement, upward mobility and into the middle class of mostly Black workers, but really workers of color. And so I think that that's something that we need to do more of, connect the erosion of public sector jobs to, taking jobs away from people of color, and especially Black folks, where historically those jobs have been a pathway to middle class jobs. And so when we talk about like cutting services also, right? These are the services that people of color are providing to the community, to those other people of color in the community who need the services the most. There's all these connections that we're trying to unmask, and I think that it's actually a really nice example of the research that CT Voices has done to really support that work that we're doing on the ground as we are fighting to make sure that those positions and those services are funded so that the community has the services that they need, and so that there's viable, strong jobs with good wages that are going to move people out of poverty.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, what a wonderful presentation, what a wonderful
panel of experts. My name is Loretta Young, and I'm with Race Matters in West Virginia. And I don't know enough about the history of minorities in union representation in West Virginia, other than the fact that I do know that there were persons who held offices in the state legislature who were minority representatives on unions, and that in many of our organizations in the community, they spoke with a great deal of respect and power. I'm concerned about three things as it relates to what I see in West Virginia and in my line of work. Number one, are we really together? You know, I hear, you know, whenever we say AFL-CIO, I hear this big roar, but are we really together? When we were working to get Joe Manchin off of the, you know, his butt and voting in support of the Build Back Better, there was a group of groups in West Virginia that said to us, organizers, we cannot attack Joe Manchin. That's not the way to get Joe to vote with you. He doesn't like to be confronted. And whenever those of us who were fighting, you know, we were fighting for people's lives. You know, in southern West Virginia, where people were dying, where there was no water, dirty water, I mean, just basic. And we had the AFL-CIO tell us to get quiet, or when we would come out and ask him to take a position, they would come out with a big banner that says, Joe Manchin, we love you. Now, how can I trust the AFL-CIO? How can I trust them? You know, they're so busy thinking Joe's going to do something eventually for us. But in the meantime, there are people dying. What about the teachers' union? You know, we were very proud in West Virginia about how all the red shirts were there, but one of the biggest organizers among the teachers said the reason why they did that, where they were successful this time, some of their union representatives were silenced. They were having a conversation with the governor saying that the teachers in Mingo County have agreed to go back to work. And because of social media, the teachers in Mingo County heard them and said, no, we're not. But in the past, these union representatives made nice with leadership. I just got to ask that question. Number two, prison industries burns me up. You know, this is slavery. Come on, people. Can I get an amen anywhere in that? This is slavery. This is slavery. This private industry of allowing inmates and those that are incarcerated to work for what, 25, 75 cents an hour? That's nothing but slavery, and I'm against slavery. If these, for example, in terms of furniture making, if this was something that was in the community that had employees, they'd have to pay them their health care, retirement. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm against this. What are we going to do about that? One of the projects we have, Jamie Worker, who's probably in here, will probably kill me, but Jamie Worker got me involved with this group, and I love her to death. One of the things that we are working with the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy is with what are some policy positions that we can take that will help enable persons who are incarcerated to come out and make high-paying jobs. That's an oxymoron. I mean, let's just say that from the very beginning. First of all, that would mean that while incarcerated and in jail and prison, that those persons who were incarcerated had access to training, and training in the high-paying fields of technology, whatever. So anyway, those are some disturbing things to us, and I think that we've got to, Al Sharpton said that the reason why we can't get it together like they did during the march was because so many of our folks are in the pockets of our politicians. I'm just going to say that, and I'll pass it on to others.
Loretta, thank you for those comments. I agree with you. North Carolina used to be the furniture capital of the world. Those jobs didn't go anywhere. They didn't leave the country with NAFTA. Those jobs are now being taking place. That furniture is being built by people who are incarcerated. And it was a business strategy. I just want to respond about the comments that you made about the AFL-CIO and the labor movement. The labor movement has become synonymous with the union movement. And the union movement does not cover all workers. And so my response would be that we don't need a labor movement, we need a worker movement, a movement where all workers are protected. That's unemployed, underemployed, all workers. And until we center our activity around all workers, we're going to continuously have these silos where we try to protect, our interests, and it's the protecting of the union's interests, right, that creates this divisiveness, and it keeps you from working towards the bigger picture. It's what I mentioned before when I said the system of keeping us disorganized and confused. When unions are not focusing and organizing and building power for all workers, we all lose. And so I would say my response is that we don't need to strengthen the union movement, we need to build a worker movement.
Loretta, I also want to thank you for sharing your comments. We are having this session today and many others today to surface a lot of the challenging and difficult issues that we see and often don't feel like there's an opportunity to voice or don't feel like they're being heard. So I just want to acknowledge and appreciate your willingness to share that, and I encourage people to continue having these kinds of conversations. And I'm sure there are others in the room who can identify and have frustrations of their own as well. So we want this to be a productive opportunity for that. We knew when we started this plenary that there were going to be some difficult and uncomfortable conversations perhaps coming out of this. And so, I wanted to end this maybe on a lighter, slightly lighter note, hopefully. And I think one of the things that has helped to unify people over time and motivate various movements throughout history has been music. So the last question that I want to throw to the panelists as we close today, and I'll put this slide up that shares some information on some of the resources that they mentioned today. The slides will be available, so when you actually get access to this, you can actually click on the links and go and find those things. But the question I want to pose to our panelists as we wrap up here is what song or songs, can be old school or new, would you add to the playlist for racial, gender, and economic justice? Tanya, can I start with you?
So my old school song would be Donna Summer's She Worked Hard for the Money. And my new school song is Land of the Free by Joey Badass.
I just had an old school one, because we've lost Pharaoh Sanders this week. You've got to have freedom.
Okay, I don't know if Valerie knew what she was getting into when she asked us this. I have quite a few songs. So some contemporary songs about voice that come to mind are Birds Set Free by Sia, Fight Song by Rachel Platten, Girl on Fire by Alicia Keys. And you may find a trend here. All of my songs are powerful female singers. I also have Roar by Katy Perry, Beyonce's We Run the World, Lizzo's Good as Hell, and I want to throw it back to Nina Simone. And one of her songs that I always go back to is Feeling Good. And the very, very, very final last song by Nina Simone, I Wish I Knew How It Feel to Be Free. And a very specific stanza in there I'd like to share with you. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free.
And that's the perfect way to end it. Let's thank our panelists. Tanya Wallace-Gobern, William Jones, and Tarn Goelling. Thank you.